Hello, and welcome back to the Alexander Society.
Hello, just a quick little note before we get into the rest of the episode. These episodes we're getting into the next couple releases were recorded out of order. So what happened is we got behind on the Malcolm X episode and we themed a couple episodes. So that kind of put us where we have to release these out of order. Because these were filmed out of order, we're going to have two Alexander articles in a row, which were the Malcolm X episode and the San Patricios episode. And then our next episode will be our April 1st, loosely related April 1st Bonnie and Clyde episode. The following episode will be our episode on Theranos, which will, like our normal 2-week release format, come out 2 weeks after April 1st. We'll get back into the recording.
This is a podcast about drinking and history, of course. Mostly drinking. Should be mostly history, but we've got problems, okay? We've got problems. And we need, I don't know where I'm going with this, actually. I was just trying to,
Fuck if I know, Derek.
fuck if I know me too. Fuck it. I'm your host, a down on its luck traveler witnessing the horrors of imperialism firsthand, Derek. Joined by my friend and co-host, a helpless civilian being held at bayonet point, Tim. How you doing, Tim?
I'm doing pretty good. Had a pretty good Valentine's Day, and I heard you did too.
Yeah, it was pretty solid. It was, yeah, it was nothing fancy schmancy. We ended up not going out or anything. We just stayed in, had some pizza, watched a movie.
What are you drinking tonight, Derek?
Oh, what am I drinking tonight? So for my beers, I went with one of our favorites, Iron Monk. I went with the Milk Stout because I thought that I really like the can, and I really like stouts. I think these might have been old cans that were on the shelf for a while because a couple of these are decarbonated. So,
You know that's not the reason.
well, they were like the cans were like a little loose when I got like before I put them in the okay. I accidentally put them in the freezer for a few hours before I started recording because I was putting my shooter in there, and I just absentmindedly put the beer in there with them. And so they ended up frozen, and so they're still kind of thawing out. But I don't think that's the reason because they were kind of squishy like before, uh, like when I got them before I put them in the freezer. So like, it I don't know. Anyways, it's flat, so it's kind of affecting the flavor a little bit, but it tastes pretty good. Like the stout part, the stout. It's nice, dark, bitter. And it has like a little bit of creaminess to it. I really like it. I'm hoping that when I get one of the more solid cans, that I can get like the full experience. So for my shooter, I went kind of thematic, kind of tangentially thematic to our topic today. I was looking for an Irish whiskey because today we're going to be doing our St. Patrick's Day episode, so I wanted to go with some Irish whiskey. I found some whiskey. It is not Irish, unfortunately. It is Texas Ranger 1823 blended whiskey. It's 40%, and it is made in San Antonio, my hometown. So yeah,
It looks like a dope bottles either way.
it's a pretty solid bottle. Yeah, it smells really good, and it's tangentially related because of Texas. It's one of those. Uh, it whatever you'll understand. Tim, what are you drinking?
So tonight I am having a red ale from Smedic and Sons Ireland. Uh, I think I'm pronouncing that right. I know it's not how it's spelt, that I would assume it's pronounced. That's all I can say. And it is a 4.5 alcohol. So I was going with the Irish theme there. And then I'm bringing back the whiskey. I know it's not an Irish whiskey, but the Irishmen love their whiskey, so I'm going with a whiskey. The Old Forester Kentucky Straight Bourbon from last week.
So here in our illustrious society, we abide by an ever changing set of rules. So Rule number one: every time the U.S. military does something fucked up, we take a sip.
Every time our subject gets screwed over, 3 sips.
And every time our subject embarrasses the United States military, what are we going to do, Tim?
We're going to take a shot.
Take a shot. That's right. Tim, do you know what we're talking about today?
I remember the idea of what happened. It is a group of Irishmen that help out with the Mexican-American War, but I can not for the life of me remember the name of the group.
Yeah, so today we're going to be talking about the Battalion de San Patricios, or the St. Patrick's Battalion, which is the broad strokes of it, which is not exactly accurate, and we'll get into why. The broad strokes is a bunch of Irishmen in the U.S. Army deserted during the Mexican American War and fought on the side of Mexico in their own unit and kicked a lot of ass doing it. It's a really cool story. So we're going to be talking about this today. It's a little bit, even though like it's still a really sad story, it's a lot more like heartwarming than a lot of the stuff we talk about, because it's a story of a bunch of guys who fought tooth and nail for a cause that they wholeheartedly believed in, to protect people that they felt were being unduly oppressed and vilified. And many of them laid down their lives for this cause, and it it's a very heartwarming story of just like sacrifice and solidarity, and it fucking sucks that it had to happen, but the fact that these guys stood up and did this is a little like bright light in an otherwise just fucking awful heinous war. So you want to go ahead and take our starting shot?
Shots up. Remember, St. Patty's Day, we double up. Assuming you want to do that.
Want to do what?
Double up shots for St. Patty's Day?
Oh, fuck yeah. Yeah, I designed the rule specifically with that in mind.
So what you're saying is our shots aren't going to be too heavy so we don't die?
Yeah, I don't think so.
Thank God, because I don't know if I could have actually done a whole lot of double shots like we did that one episode we actually remembered St. Patty's Day.
You ready?
Yep. Cheers.
Prost. All right, so to start off this topic, which, by the way, this topic is very near and dear to my heart, despite the fact that it makes my home of Texas look very, very bad in hindsight. It is not a great moment for Texas. But so to start this off, we have to talk about, as for a little background, we're going to talk about 3 different countries. First country we're going to talk about is obviously Ireland. Ireland, at this point that we're going to be talking about, this is going to be the 1840s. So a lot of the stuff that think back to our episode on John Moisebach, because this is literally like the exact time period that we talked, like the exact same time that we talked about in that episode, in the same area as well. But in the 1840s, Ireland had been under British rule for about 700 years by that point. They had been like a colony of Britain.
Damn.
And in Ireland, obviously, the Catholic faith was suppressed because the English decided, the English decided to turn away from their traditional Catholic roots and become a Protestant nation under the Church of England. And to go along with that, they extended a lot of bad shit to Ireland and Ireland's traditionally Catholic culture. Ireland is still to this day like a culture very steeped in its Catholic heritage. And they tried to, by hook or by crook, tried to strangle that out of the Irish people.
And they did not succeed.
They did not succeed, no. Um, but besides just the religious persecution, there was also Irish people were peons in their own home country. All of the land was owned by absentee English landlords, and Irish people were forced to work on British owned estates. A lot of what they were growing was very like intensive monocultures, like wheat and different types of cereals, like barley. And they weren't allowed to keep any of it. They had to give everything that they grew of these crops to their landlords as payment to be able to live on the land that they worked. Because the only other option was go homeless and die of exposure. And but they couldn't keep any of the food that they grew, and they didn't really make money off of it. And so, what they had to do in order just to survive was to grow their own crops separate from the crops that they grew, which they didn't have a lot of time for. And so, they relied very heavily on a few different like staple crops that were specifically extremely high calorie compared to the amount of work you had to put in, and were very low intensive work, very easy to grow. And so, most Irish people, as a result, relied heavily on a diet of potatoes.
Yep.
And then 1845 happened, and then there was a blight. It was a fungal disease that spread all throughout Europe and killed an entire season's worth of the potato crop. Everywhere else in Europe was more or less fine because they grew stuff other than potatoes, but in Ireland, the death of the potato crop meant the death of millions. And so for 3 years straight, 45, 46, 47, and to some extent, to a lesser extent in the following years up until like 1852, the potato crops just failed. Like they came out of the ground like rotted. And of course, this resulted in what we now know as the Great Famine, the Great Hunger, as it's known in Ireland. Don't call it the potato famine because that's really fucked up. Irish people don't like it when you call it that because it wasn't a potato famine. Because here's the thing that you got to keep in mind: Ireland was growing enough food to feed everybody in Ireland. The problem was not the amount of food. The problem was that all of the food was owned by English people. And so the English people were taking all of the food off of the island to sell somewhere else and letting the Irish people starve. It was a genocide.
Fuck the British.
Fuck the British. So, yeah, of course, we have on top of all of the political repression, you also have the crushing poverty. And so, even before the Great Hunger, a lot of Irish people were leaving Ireland and emigrating out to a variety of countries. A lot of them ended up just in England proper because there were work opportunities there. A lot of them ended up in like different parts of Europe. Spain had a big influx of immigrants from Ireland. But probably the biggest contingent went to North America, to the United States and Canada. And that's going to be a pretty prominent like causal factor in the creation of this group of Irish soldiers, is this huge influx of Irish troops into the United States. The second country we have to talk about is Mexico. Mexico is also a Catholic country, much like Ireland. They were also under the oppressive vassalage of a foreign imperial power, namely Spain. But unlike Ireland, Mexico had gained independence from their colonial overlord in 1821. And for a few years after independence, they had, for like 3 years afterwards, they had a monarchy. But eventually that monarchy was overthrown and they established the Mexican Republic. And so within Mexico, there was this ongoing political conflict amongst the amongst like the political class of Mexico between the more liberal-minded sort of federalists who believed in like a sort of a more decentralized political system where each state had its own like independent powers and authorities separate from the federal government. And then you had the more conservative centralists who believed in centralizing all political authority into the government and the central government in Mexico City. And there was an ongoing conflict between these two factions, which had resulted in a lot of contested elections, assassinations, civil wars. It's actually very shocking how many civil wars that they had within just the 20 years, the 2 or so decades between the Mexican American War and prior to that, a Mexican independence.
I didn't know it was that back and forth.
Oh yeah, it was pretty. It right up until the end of the Mexican Revolution, which we talked about in our Emiliano Zapata episode in like 1920. For like that, basically the first 100 years of Mexico's existence was just a constant on and off of civil wars between all different factions, with like a very brief sort of period of peace under Porfirio Diaz. But anyways, so during this time, Mexico was not only Mexico was not just within like the modern borders of what we now see in Mexico. It also included the modern day states of Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California, as well as various parts of like Nevada, Kansas, Colorado. So the borders were not didn't align exactly, but you kind of get like a good about 1/3 of the landmass of the contingent United States, what it is today, was during this time part of Mexico.
Okay.
But all of that area, sort of north of the Rio Grande, was like all of what would eventually become the U.S. part of the U.S. territory, is very undersettled. There's not a lot of people there, and so there's not a lot of there's not a lot of industry or government or anything like that going on, and so it's very loosely connected to the Mexican state, as it were.
Okay.
And this is for a variety of reasons. Not only is it was very underdeveloped, and so it's just difficult to get out that way, to head north into Mexico's northern frontier. And even if you do get there, there are a lot of very, very aggressive Native American tribes who would rather you just leave, such as the Comanches, the Apaches, the Utes. They didn't want settlers coming in there, which
Understandably so.
understandable, absolutely, yes. So to kind of facilitate the development of these regions of Mexico, in one particular example, the example of the state of Coahuila y Tejas, which would eventually become Texas. They instituted a policy of inviting white settlers from America, from the United States, and inviting them to move into Texas. And basically, they would move in. The Mexican government would give them land on the condition that they develop that land and turn it into something economically productive. And by doing this, they hope they would be able to like kickstart the sort of colonial economy of these more rural frontier areas. No, very few policies have ever backfired as badly as this decision, because all of these Americans, they did move in, but they did not appreciate the idea of being Mexican, which was kind of part of the deal of moving there.
It's the same reason why Texas seceding will never work, because they'll still be wrapped up in their U.S. identity.
Right, yeah, yeah, and so the people who moved there, for one, they didn't want to learn Spanish. That was off the table. For another thing, they thought Mexicans were like dirty and lazy, and they didn't want to be associated with Mexicans. For a third thing, they thought that they hated the Catholic faith, and they didn't want anything to do with Catholicism. And for a fourth thing, the vast majority of the people that were moving to Texas came from southern states, and so they wanted to bring their slaves with them, which was a problem because slavery was illegal in Mexico.
As it should have already been in America.
As it should have been, yeah. And so you had a lot of Americans moving into Texas for the economic opportunities, but then they ended up chafing against all of these, the conditions of them moving there in the first place, and wanted to kind of, eventually it kind of got to the point where like, well, maybe this should probably just be the U.S. And so that was kind of like flopping around back and forth, that kind of idea of Texas should just be part of the U.S. instead of Mexico. And then in 1834, you have another national election in Mexico, and the conservative centralists completely dominate. They seize the presidency, and they completely seize the Mexican Congress. And this guy, this war hero in Mexico by the name of Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, he is elected president. And he tries the some sort of like liberal, some like mild, moderate liberal reforms just to kind of test the waters and see what he can do. Some reforms buying up like church lands, like lands that are owned by the Catholic Church, so that he can like portion them off and give them to like poor settlers and or like poor like lower class people, so that they can have like a plot of land to farm. So there was this vision of kind of turning Mexico into a land of small landowning farmers, that kind of thing. And it turns out that those reforms were pretty popular amongst like the general Mexican population, but they were very unpopular with a lot of the richer people and more powerful people, namely the Catholic Church and the Mexican army, who really didn't like them. And so he got a little spooked when they started to kind of push back, and so Santa Anna did a complete 180, and he dissolved the Mexican Parliament and made himself the dictator.
Fucking Christ! And he was a centrist.
Yeah, he started this off as like a moderate. He was like a moderate liberal, and then he just went full military dictator.
Fucking hell.
So, understandably, when he did that, many Mexican people were very pissed off, understandably. And rebellions just started popping up all over Mexico. Just every little nook and cranny was a little rebel army.
As they should have.
As they should have, yeah. The biggest and scariest one was the one that appeared in Texas, because all of these Anglos, with lots of money from the United States, were buying up some pretty big, hefty guns. And so Santa Anna decided that all of these Anglos in Texas are probably going to be my biggest priority. And so he led the Mexican army into Texas personally, and he tried to disarm the Anglo settlers. And they responded by pulling up a white flag with a black cannon on it and a black star that said, "Come and take it," and firing a single shot into the Mexican lines, launching off the Battle of Gonzales, which was the starting shot of the Texas Revolution.
Damn.
Yeah. So Texas revolts. You get the Battle of the Alamo, where all of the Texans get killed, and then you have a bunch of in another skirmish. There are like three. So you have the slaughter at the Alamo, and then a little while later you have like this mass execution of Texan POWs called the Goliad Massacre. And so that inflamed a lot of Texan frustration at the Mexican government, and it also Also, the Battle of the Alamo cleared up a lot of the leadership within the Texan cause and kind of cleared the way for General Sam Houston to kind of take overall control of the Texian army. And he was able to lead the Texans at the victory at the Battle of San Jacinto, where they actually captured Santa Anna and forced him to recognize Texan independence, and how that is how the Texas Revolution was won. Yeah, it. Oh yeah. As speaking as a Texan, the Texas Revolution is it's not as black and white, either good or bad, as a lot of people make it out to be, because you had a lot of bad shit like
It's a bunch of stupid on both sides.
yes, um, but even like the Texan Revolutionary cause, it was a lot of them did it because they wanted to have slaves in Texas and they wanted to bring Texas in as a slave state. But then you had a lot of people who just genuinely fucking hated Santa Anna because he was a dictator. A lot of them, including like there were a lot of Mexicans who fought in the Texan armies during the Texas Revolution. Juan Seguin was just a guy who hated dictatorships and loved freedom, and he got and became like a proud citizen of the Republic of Texas, and they treated him like shit for the rest of his life because he was Mexican. Because they're fucking assholes.
I find most Texans are.
Yeah, I can't. I was about to be offended, but then I realized I can't be offended because we bring it on ourselves. So, anyways, uh, Texas independence is one. Santa Anna becomes so unpopular because of all of these failures that he is actually overthrown and exiled to Cuba. And Texas becomes an independent republic and immediately starts petitioning the United States to annex them as a state. So that brings us to the third country we have to talk about, which is, of course, the United States of America.
Good old US of A.
US of A. The United States at this point is a very young country. It has only existed in the form that it is taking at that moment for, let's see, about 50 years by that point.
A young man at that point
And
of a country.
it is a young man, and that young man is going west. So this is the 1840s. Manifest Destiny is a thing now. It is in full swing. And Manifest Destiny is basically this ideology that grew up in the United States during this time, that they basically believed that it was the destiny of the Anglo-Saxon Americans to spread the light of democracy and civilization to the savage and untamed lands of the American West and become a power on the North American continent from the East Coast to the West Coast. That is the ultimate.
I don't know why I didn't ever, as a kid, stop and ask why Manifest Destiny doesn't make any fucking sense.
Yeah, it didn't make any sense. And there were a lot of Americans who were like, hey, this is pretty fucking stupid. We're fine right here. But they were argued down because, of course, there's a lot of money out west, of course. So yeah, we're in this process. We of course have the biggest to this point. The biggest expansion had come with the Louisiana Purchase, where President Thomas Jefferson bought basically everywhere from the Mississippi River all the way out to the border of Mexico. About a third of the entire landmass of the modern United States from Napoleon.
It was Napoleon who was ruling at the time?
Yeah. Jefferson bought it from France, and because Napoleon needed money for all of his wars. At this at this point, we're talking about the 1840s. This is about 25 years after Napoleon was defeated at Waterloo. But while he was still in power, he sold the Louisiana Purchase to President Thomas Jefferson. And so that opened up a huge amount of lands that kind of fostered this sort of ideology that, well, it's America's destiny to go west and find new opportunities and settled untamed wilderness, and spread the light of civilization and democracy. All that horseshit. And there's a heavy racial component to Manifest Destiny as well. Specifically, it was advocating. It was a belief that it was American destiny to spread from sea to shining sea, but more specifically, Anglo-Saxon American to spread.
Yeah, I didn't know about the racial component of that growing up. I wonder why they didn't teach us that in American history class.
Yeah. It didn't. Yeah, it's so crazy that like they still like even in my like relatively progressive sort of public education, they talked about like how they framed like racism as like a pretty nasty stain on American history, but they still kind of revere like the concept of manifest destiny and the importance of like the inherent truth of like America's ultimate destiny to rule the broad expanses of the continent. It's very bizarre that they've kind of divorced the racism from like the inherent racism from this sort of ideology.
They'll do anything to like it. What we did wasn't bad. It was only right.
But specifically, this racism was not just restricted to white people good, other non-white people bad. They were also racist against like other white people.
Of course they were.
So specifically, like they didn't like Spaniards, they didn't like Germans, uh, for a variety of reasons, a variety of both like stereotypes and like the early sort of nascent race science. This is right around the time when phrenology or the like measuring skulls was first starting to become a thing. But specifically, they had like a very deep hatred of Irish people, and it was both a racial thing. They believed that Irish were inherently like spiritually, and that genetic science wasn't a thing yet, but more or less like within their blood inferior, that they were inherently like stupid and drunkard and lazy and subservient. And this was also tied into American like Anglo-Saxon Protestantism, Puritanism, uh, and like early like very radical strands of Protestantism that came over and settled the United States were still like very prominent in American society at this point and had very much formed a lot of American culture. And a big part of that sort of Protestant culture was a seething hatred of Catholicism and the Catholic faith. They referred to it as popery, as papism, as idolatry. They believed that the veneration of the Virgin Mary was idol worship. They believed that the Pope was a secret Satanist and stuff like that.
Jesus Christ.
Yeah, they believed, and this is more or less kind of a belief that you'll find right up until like the mid 1900s. It wasn't until like after Kennedy got shot that like the American public at large like kind of started trusting Catholics implicitly and started to see them as like co-equal partners in American society. Because even when Kennedy was president, there were people talking about like, can we have a Catholic president? What if his loyalties are?
I remember that. I remember people asking if he was going to be beholden to the Pope on Kennedy.
Yes, yeah, yeah. They that was a big thing. It's like, what if we have a president whose true loyalties lie with Rome? Then the entire country is going to be controlled by the Pope. This was the fucking 1960s. Imagine how bad it was in the 1840s. And so this anti-Catholic, anti-Irish hatred was becoming like a mania in the United States. By around 1845, race riots against Irish neighborhoods in like large cities, the biggest one being in Philadelphia, they were like a regular occurrence. There was a huge one in Philadelphia where like a quarter of the city was burned to the ground and hundreds of Irish people were lynched in the streets. It was incredible how violent this hatred was, and it was
I didn't know there were any Irish race riots.
oh yeah, they were pretty common during around this time in America during that time. somewhere, some crazy, I can't remember the exact percentage, but some crazy percentage, like between like 20 and 40% of all literature published in the United States had something to do with like denouncing uh, Catholicism, and like was in some way like anti-Catholic. Like everywhere you went, even like just picking up a newspaper, you'd find like an anti-Catholic screed. It was everywhere.
Jeez, it's wild finding what people used to believe that was like bigoted.
And this anti-Catholic discrimination also extended into the U.S. Army, which uh, which the U.S. Army during this time had a disproportionately large amount of Irish Catholic servicemen, because a lot of Irish people that came over didn't have, they weren't going to be hired by anywhere else. They're Irish, they're Catholic, they're not, nobody's going to hire them. And so their only real prospect for like, a paycheck was to enlist in the US Army. And so the army had a huge population. Irish people made up about 10% of the American population by this point, which is pretty fucking huge. They made up about 20 to 25% of the total manpower of the U.S. military. They were a huge part of the U.S. military during this time.
I'm not surprised.
And in the U.S. military, not only were they blocked from promotion, most Irishmen couldn't. You were lucky if you were able to be promoted to like sergeant, and to be promoted any further from that to be like an officer or something, you had to bury your Catholic faith or just completely abandon it altogether. And a lot of Irishmen like changed their names just to be able to like advance in rank or anything like that.
Smells like America.
Yeah. And if you were open about your faith and people saw your bright red hair or heard your accent, if you're superior officers, that is, you could be, well, for starters, you didn't have any chaplains. There were no Catholic chaplains in the U.S. Army. And Catholic soldiers were not allowed to go to Catholic masses. They were required to go to Protestant masses, where the Protestant preachers would speak about the evils of Catholicism and popery. If you tried to practice your faith, you would be usually physically assaulted by your superior officer in some way, and if you continued to persist, you would eventually be court-martialed for insubordination. That was very common. If you were an Irishman in the U.S. military, you were treated like absolute utter shit. There was no future for you.
But of course.
And so you had the Texas Revolution, 1835, 1836, and then in 1845, it took about 9 years because a lot of people didn't like the idea of including another slave state, and so there's like a lot of political maneuvering and stuff like that that had to be done. But eventually, in 1845, the United States finally annexes Texas as a state, and this doesn't go over very well in Mexico. Mexicans didn't really like this because to the Mexican government, the treaty that had recognized Texan independence was signed by a president under duress, and so it wasn't legally binding, and so they still considered Texas to be part of Mexico.
I mean, would there be any scenario where it wasn't under duress, though, when they were revolting like that?
Okay. So, not only was Mexico not happy about the fact that Texas was essentially just stolen from them by the United States government, but they were also unhappy because the U.S. and Mexico couldn't really agree on like where the border of Texas was, because when the Mexican government under duress recognized Texan independence, it was under the belief that uh, it was under the belief that the Republic of Texas borders adhered to the existing state borders for the state of Tejas within the Mexican federal system. Whereas the Texans believed that it was further south. Specifically, the Mexicans thought that the border was at the Nueces River. The Texans believed that it was at the Rio Grande. And so Mexicans started to make a big fuss about, like, well, we still own this. If you have Texas, we still own this strip of land between the Rio Grande and the Nueces. We still own that part of it. And America was like, no, we own it all the way to the Rio Grande. That was the borders of the Republic of Texas. And so they started like a diplomatic incident, which eventually resulted in the United States sending troops down to the Rio Grande River into the disputed territory. And right along the banks of the Rio Grande River, they built a fort, which they called Fort Texas. And then they started to just kind of like do regular like patrols along the banks of the river, just kind of like egging the Mexican army on to kind of do something about it. Until eventually the Mexican army did indeed do something about it. They a detachment against orders, a detachment of the or of the Mexican army against orders, ambushed an American unit on patrol, killing 11 and capturing 59, and then that started an enormous internet like diplomatic incident, which then resulted on a Mexican general ordering cannons to be fired onto Fort Texas. And these shots fired onto Fort Texas was the pretext that the United States needed to declare war on Mexico. And so in 1846, 1846, the United States declares war on Mexico, and the Mexican-American War begins. So, let's back up a little bit to around 1817 or 1818. We're not sure exactly when. It's a little hazy. There's a man by the name of John Riley, or in his native Irish, Sean O'Reilly.
Ah, so it was a little bit of like Americanized to make him less Irish.
Yeah, and he anglicized his own name when he moved to the United States.
I meant to ask, is it always called anglicized if you're trying to fit in, or is it just particularly for English?
It's called anglicized if you're trying to make it sound more like it'll fit with the English language. So, John Riley, he's born sometime around 1817, 1818, in the town of Clifton in County Galway in Ireland. Not much is known about his early life, like what he was doing when he was growing up, what he was doing when he was a young adult. We're fairly sure that he served in the British Army, as many Irish people did join the British Army in an attempt to kind of escape from poverty. And while in the British Army, he was eventually stationed in Canada, and he eventually left the British military while he was still in Canada, and he moved to Michigan. And when he got to Michigan, he realized that there were no job prospects there for an Irishman, and so he enlisted in the United States Army. He joined Company K of the 5th U.S. Infantry Regiment, and he was sent down to Texas to help garrison the disputed territory there with Mexico.
Alrighty.
Yeah. And while he was in the U.S. Army, he was, of course, like every other Catholic Irishman, heavily mistreated, repeatedly beaten. He was denied his own faith. And so eventually, John Riley and another Irishman by the name of Patrick Dalton, they deserted from the U.S. Army and they fled to Mexico. And this was just a few months before the war started. So they were already there. But the war hadn't actually begun yet. And they deserted and they fled to Mexico. And once they got to Mexico, John Riley offered his services to the Mexican army. He enlisted in the Mexican army, and they took him on. And at first, he was just like a regular, like they brought him in as like a sergeant because it's kind of believed that he had been a sergeant in the British Army, though we're not completely sure. But he was brought in as like a non-commissioned officer into the Mexican Army, and then after war was declared, a whole bunch more Catholics, specifically Irish, started deserting from the United States Army and flooding over the border to take shelter in Mexico. And these guys were motivated by a variety of different things. A lot of them were they were just hardcore Catholics who didn't want to fight fellow Catholics. A lot of them were Irish Republicans who, and like early Irish nationalists, who recognized that what the United States was doing to Mexico was the same thing that the English had done to Ireland. And so they wanted to fight on a cause that they felt solidarity with, being from a nation in a similar situation. And then a lot of them just kind of they knew that the Mexican army was like offering land, and so they wanted to come over and just wanted to have a better life. They wanted to serve a country that would give them a better life. So it was a variety of reasons. The vast majority of them like noble, like earnest and heartfelt and ideologically driven and genuine. They were like the people who fled from the U.S. Army and joined the Mexican Army had genuine, heartfelt convictions that that motivated them to do the things that they did, which is a big deal because later on, a lot of American scholarship on these guys would make them out to be like just drunkards and mercenaries.
Trying to discredit them.
Right, yeah. And so a lot of them ended up coming under the wing of John Riley, who was one of the first Irish deserters before the war even began. And they all got together, and then they were joined by a large number of Europeans who were already living in Mexico at the time. So a lot of not just Irish, but like a lot of Catholic, or a lot of Catholic. They were all Catholic, but a lot of Germans. There were a lot of Germans in this unit as well. A few Polish, a few Spanish, just kind of from all over. They're just a lot of different walks of life. Pretty much all universally Catholic. But the vast majority of them were Irish. And so they all got together, having enlisted in the Mexican army, and they were placed in their own sort of foreign. It was like a foreign legion unit, and this unit was formally named the St. Patrick's Battalion.
Interesting.
Under the under the command of John Riley, and and these guys they're most commonly known by their Spanish name, the San Patricios. They fought under the banner that they carried, the flag, their unit flag that they carried into battle. We don't have any. It didn't survive the war. We have no idea where it is, if it even still exists. But we can kind of like from eyewitness testimonies, we can kind of gather what their flag looked like. So the basic design that I've seen is on one side it's a silk flag. It's just a solid green silk flag. And on one side is a golden harp, which represents Ireland, and then a bunch of like green shamrocks around the harp. And at the bottom it says in Irish, Erin Gobra, which is that's an Irish term. It translates as Ireland forever. And then on the flip side of the flag is a mural depicting St. Patrick, who with his like bishop's hat and his shepherd's crook, And below that, it says in Spanish, Libertad por la República Mexicana, which translates as freedom for the Republic of Mexico.
I kind of was able to parse that. That was kind of simple.
Yeah. Yeah, it is pretty simple. But yeah, this is how the confluence of these three nations and their experiences all come together in one conflict to create this utterly unique and incredible phenomenon. Yeah, this group of men who all more or less separately but still connected, risking life and limb to abandon a superior, a more powerful army to fight for a cause that they know is most likely doomed, but doing so because they feel that it is right, both for their own spiritual faith and for the well being of the Mexican people, because they identify so powerfully with the Mexican people's plight in this situation, because it's the exact same plight that they were fleeing from back home in Ireland.
I mean, it sounds like the exact same scenario that if America could have gotten away with it, what is now known as Mexico today, more of it would be known as the U.S.
At the end of the war, a lot of people in the US government were really wondering why they didn't just take all of it. And the only real argument they had for why they didn't just take all of it was just racism. They just didn't want more Mexicans in their country.
Wow.
Yeah, that's really the only argument against it. And that's the one that won out. So the war breaks out. The U.S. forces invade northern Mexico. They are under the command of these two guys. One is a name you've probably heard before because he eventually becomes a president. His name is General Zachary Taylor,
Yep.
and he has joint command with another commander by the name of General Winfield Scott, who's a real bastard.
I feel like I've heard of him, but I don't know his feats.
Yeah. Winfield Scott he's a real bastard even by the standards of the time. Something I want to go ahead and get out of the way early here, real quick. The Mexican-American War is in the running for one of the most war crimey wars that the United States has ever done.
That's saying something.
Yeah. The main book that I read for this research, repeatedly compares the Mexican-American War to the war in Vietnam.
Fuck.
Yeah, it is bad, the things that the U.S. Army does to these people. And a lot of it is at the behest of Winfield Scott. He's a real war crime loving sort of guy.
It's really hard to love our country when hearing all the bullshit we've pulled.
Yeah. There's a reason that the Mexican American War is one of the forgotten wars, even though it was the single largest acquisition of land in U.S. history through warfare. And the reason we forgot about it is because looking back on it does not make the United States look good in any feasible way.
Not in the slightest.
Yeah, because even at the time, every single like ideological or political justification for the war and for the annexation of northern Mexico, by the standards of today, is like actual Nazi shit. Like literally stuff that like the Nazis would have agreed with. And sounded like stuff the Nazis used to justify their own wars.
I mean, if we sit down and look at a lot of our wars, you could see a lot of the ideology that Nazis would, I bet. Like, because it's on a lot of our wars, it was just, I want it, I want to say. Like, that we started and not like we got involved in wars.
Well, have you ever heard the term Lebensraum?
Nope.
Lebensraum is German for living space. And it was this part of the Nazi ideology that they needed to go out and conquer all of Europe so that they could clear out all of the inferior races that lived there and open up that land for German settlement. That is just Manifest Destiny. That is the exact same ideology, almost word for word, that prompted Manifest Destiny, the westward expansion of the United States.
That doesn't surprise me in the least bit.
Yeah, It it makes a lot of sense that one of Hitler's favorite genre of movies was westerns.
It does.
So, the first engagement that the San Patricios are involved in, or the first big one, they've got a few smaller skirmishes, but the first big one where they kind of make their name is called the Battle of Monterrey, and it's very early in the war. And the San Patricios are kind of acting as they're acting as the artillery unit. So they've got the cannons. They're the ones who are firing the giant guns at the American troops. And as it turned
Bitches love cannons.
Bitches love cannons, yeah. As it turns out, the San Patricios are fucking amazing cannoneers. Like they were at this point, they were using cannons that were like something like 40 or 50 years old.
God damn.
Yeah, and they had a range that was about half the distance of the American cannons, which were all brand new and state of the art, like cutting edge of military technology. And they were just wiping the floor with the US cannons.
Damn.
They like in the cannon, like every cannon duel that they got in, like a lot of battles during this time would open with a cannon duel where the cannons would kind of like fire back and forth at each other trying to dislodge one another so that when the infantry started advancing they'd have less like artillery fire on them. Almost every cannon duel that the San Patricios ever got in with American forces, they won with cannons which were vastly inferior. It had much worse range, were more likely to just blow up because they were so old. They were causing like multiple like American artillery batteries to just turn and run away because they were such blistering fire. And then after the initial artillery duel, they just turned their cannons onto the American forces and just wreak bloody havoc across the killing zone. And that's exactly what happened at Monterey. They successfully used the artillery and they threw back 3 successive waves of American troops before the Mexican like you'll notice a trend in every single engagement that the San Patricios are in. They don't lose because they're bad at shooting. They lose because the Mexican infantry are all very poorly trained because they're all just conscripts and they don't really have like very good organization.
So you're saying it was a literal skill issue, but not the canning skill issue?
Yeah, cannons always on point, always like brilliant. It's the only reason the San Patricios like they're not just like a company of like they're not just like a company of like mercenaries or like conscripts that are just in it for the money and will break the second they're in danger. These guys are probably one of the best trained and disciplined units in the entire Mexican army. They are like the elite of the Mexican army. It is incredible how like proficient they are at warfare, which makes sense because a lot of them because most of them were trained by the US Army and a lot of them have like military experience in armies back in Europe as well. And so they've gotten like cutting edge, like top of the line modern military training that most of the rest of the Mexican army just doesn't have. And so they end up coming out a lot better than a lot of like the standing Mexican force, which isn't to disparage the Mexican forces. There are many of them who are very well trained and even more greatly disciplined because they're fighting for their homeland. Like that, there's a just certain level of discipline that just kind of goes along with that fact, is knowing that you're the only thing standing between this horde of marauding rapists and your family back home. It's a testament. There are so many stories of awe-inspiring bravery from the Mexican army during this war, just against overwhelming odds. They just keep doing badass shit. It's just a matter of their leaders were politicians and they just didn't have the resources to effectively train everybody or keep everybody well supplied. That was basically it. If it were just down to motivation alone, the Mexican army would have wiped the floor with the Americans. But unfortunately, there is, you got to keep your soldiers armed and fed too.
Honestly, it sounds like they had the better motivation. The U.S. just was be pompous prigs.
Yeah. So yeah, the Battle of Monterrey, the cannons of the San Patricios throw back 3 successive waves of American troops. It just fucking, and the Americans aren't expecting stiff resistance like this because they're expecting like a bunch of the stereotype, the lazy, unintelligent, like peon Mexicans. They don't expect uh, they don't expect them to like, hold up as well as they are. But eventually they are forced to withdraw. But this being what like the first big engagement of the war, as the American troops move into Monterrey, they start carrying out reprisals because they're pissed off about how many guys they lost in those 3 failed waves. And so they take out their anger and frustration on the civilian population when they get into town.
Which is some of the pettiest and like, it's just small PP energy.
Yeah, yeah. You can't take out all your aggression on somebody who's better and stronger than you. So you got to go take it out on the weak unarmed civilians. And that's not unique to the U.S. This U.S. military force either. It's pretty much universal amongst like every armed force on the planet throughout all of human history. That's always what happens. But yeah, there's a lot of dragging people out of their homes, shooting them, putting them up against the wall, shooting them. There's a lot of sexual assaults, a lot of looting and theft. They especially target churches. The American troops, they like to target churches and monasteries and convents and things like that. And so all of the Irish troops that are part of this American force see what they're doing to their clergy, to the Catholic clergy, and to their churches and their sacred sites, and they come to the realization that I'm fighting against people that I have more in common with than any of the men here who just hate me for who I am. And so after the Battle of Monterey, you get another huge wave of Irish desertions that just flood over the border and join the Mexican army.
Which is hella respectable.
Yeah, that's great. That is what I encourage anybody to do. That's the most morally conscionable thing that you could possibly do in that situation. And so there's such a big influx after the Battle of Monterey that the San Patricios numbers swell to about 200. And if that doesn't sound like a lot, keep in mind that we're talking about some relatively small military forces here of like a few thousand apiece.
Damn, I didn't realize it was that small.
Yeah, I think at their height, the U.S. Army is going to have like 14 to 16,000 troops. The Mexican army is going to have like 20,000. So these aren't huge armies we're talking about. So 200 guys is not enormous, but it's pretty sizable. That's 2 infantry. That's two companies, and so the San Patricios, with this influx, they now grow big enough that they can now field 2 companies worth of men, which is that makes them a pretty sizable, pretty important force in like the Mexican military by that point. So fast forward a little bit, they've got this whole time they're fighting like minor skirmishes, engagement, things like that. The next big engagement that they have is the Battle of Buena Vista, and just like what happened at the Battle of Monterey, they start off the battle with an artillery duel, and they destroy the American artillery so thoroughly at the outset of the Battle of Buena Vista that the Mexican general in command sees what's happening, and he watches like through his spying glass, and he physically sees all of the American troops just abandon their cannons and run away because they're under such blistering fire from the San Patricios. And so he orders part of the San Patricios to take up their muskets and go and clear out the remaining American troops and their artillery position and capture the guns. And so that's exactly what they do. Is a like a couple squadrons of San Patricios just sneak up on whoever's remaining, still manning these cannons, and they launch a bayonet charge into them, kill and scare off the last remaining American artillerymen, and then under the cover of the San Patricio cannons that are keeping the rest of the American troops at bay, they have enough time to physically drag the American cannons back to the Mexican lines. And then, and then they just turn the cannons around and start using them on the Americans. And again, brand new, cutting edge military technology cannons in the hands of the San Patricios, they just tear shit up.
So would you say that that is an embarrassment of the U.S.?
Oh, it was so embarrassing for the U.S. It pissed them off so bad. Before we take, was that a
Double, two shots.
two shots? Before we do our two shots, I want to tell you the next part.
Okay.
The American general in charge of this battle, General Zachary Taylor, future U.S. president, he was so angry that his cannons got captured that he sent in one of the most elite units that he had in his force, the First Dragoons. He sent them in to dislodge the San Patricios, but the San Patricio cannons just tore them apart during their charge. And about half of the Dragoons were killed before they were forced to turn back and run away without having not stepped a foot onto the Mexican line. And that was one of the most elite and veteran troops in the entire American force. Just cut, half of them cut down in a matter of 2 minutes.
Shit. So he really embarrassed them.
Oh, it was such a nightmare for the Americans at this battle. Prost.
Cheers.
So the Battle of Buena Vista. It was really bad for the Americans, but they still did win because, like always, the whole Mexican line just couldn't stand up to the better training and the better armed American troops. And so they were eventually forced to withdraw. And the San Patricios were able to cover the Mexican withdrawal with artillery fire long enough for them to get their entire force out. And so the Mexican army was saved from just complete destruction. But this battle was really bad for the San Patricios. They lost, over the course of the battle, they lost about a third of their numbers, killed or wounded.
Damn.
Yeah. So after this you're starting to get to about the midpoint of the war. It's about to get to the later stage. The Mexican forces are kind of starting to get a little desperate. They started trying to employ new tactics to kind of disrupt the American fighting capability. Something that they use is to try to encourage more Irish troops to desert from the U.S. Army.
I mean, it probably not a bad move.
And John Riley takes a central role in this. He writes a lot of propaganda pamphlets and things like that get kind of distributed throughout the U.S. Army ranks. Basically encouraging... Yeah, and it basically the line he takes is Irish soldiers, don't fight for these men who hate you. Come fight for people who are like you, who know the struggle against foreign oppression. And he also took an anti-slavery line in a lot of it, like why are you fighting for a nation that enslaves human beings when don't give your life for rich slavers in Virginia, that kind of thing. It had mixed results. It definitely helped kind of bring a few deserters over the border, but it was not widespread enough to really make a dent in the U.S. Army, fighting ability. So late in the war, General Winfield Scott decides that, and this war does not last very long. It's 10 months.
Oh, I didn't know it was that quick of a war.
Yeah, it starts in 1846, ends in 1847. It's less than a year. But it's getting later in the war. Winfield Scott wants to get it done as soon as possible. So what he does is he drafts up a plan to strike directly at the Mexican heartland in order to force the Mexican government to capitulate. And so he gets a whole force of U.S. Marines and launches a naval invasion at the port town of Veracruz, which we have talked about previously, in both in our Emiliano Zapata episode and in our Smedley Butler episode. There were Marines that landed in Veracruz during the Mexican Revolution. As it turns out, that that was 1913. 1913 was not the first time that there were U.S. Marines in Veracruz. 1847 was the first time.
Wow.
Yeah, and Winfield Scott's forces, they land at Veracruz, and they very rapidly push inward and just beeline for Mexico City. The last line of defense before American forces reach Mexico City is a town called Churubusco. And the San Patricios are taken from northern Mexico and are taken south to aid in the defense of Churubusco. The town was situated alongside a river, and there was a single bridge leading into town which connected to the road that led right into the heart of Mexico City. And the Mexican troops set up barricades and trenches and planned to hold this bridge by any means necessary. At the end of the bridge that was closest to Mexico City, right at the foot of the bridge, right up against the river, was a convent full of nuns. The nuns were evacuated, and the San Patricios wheeled their cannons in to the convent to fire through the windows over the river into the American forces. So when the American forces started trying to attack over the bridge, they came under just incredibly blistering fire from the convent, both cannon fire and all of the San Patricios were using American built Brown Besses. Basically, the guns that they had been issued by the U.S. Army, they took with them when they defected to the Mexican Army, and so they were still using American guns. And these American muskets were brand new, state of the art, had a lot better range than the guns that the Mexican Army were using, which was a lot of them were guns that were used in the Mexican Revolution, the Mexican War of Independence. They were old.
Damn.
So San Patricios had cannons, they had really good guns, so they were putting down a lot of really nasty fire from the convent, and
sounds like it.
While the Mexican, they're referred to in the literature. Yeah, they were referred the Mexican troops that were holding the ground in front of the bridgehead are referred to as National Guard. Calling them National Guard was probably a bit too formal. What these guys were essentially just militia. They were civilians which were plopped out of their homes, handed a gun, and told to go shoot a Yank. Gringos over there, pull the trigger, and you get a dead gringo.
I mean, given the circumstances, can't say they did anything wrong.
Especially this late in the war, you take what you can get. So the Mexican National Guard and the San Patricios are able to hold back several successive waves of American attacks. The bridge is littered with the bodies of dead Americans, and their blood is pouring over the sides into the river. It is a nasty sight. And they're doing pretty good, and they probably could have kept this up until the Americans bled themselves dry. The problem was, eventually the Mexicans ran out of ammunition. And once the Mexican National Guard ran out of ammunition, they started to flee. And so eventually
where is it Mexicans or Americans who fled?
Mexicans.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, the Mexican National Guard.
I mean, I understand why they would flee. They have no way to defend themselves.
Yeah. Yeah, so eventually the American troops are able to overrun the bridgehead and they surround the convent. They're still not able to take the convent quite yet because, again, they're under blistering fire from some of the best trained guys in the entire Mexican army. But they're eventually able to force their way into the convent. During the fighting, some of the Mexican National Guardsmen that are in the convent itself, fighting alongside the San Patricios, they try to raise a white flag of surrender.
And the Americans ignore it?
No, they want them to surrender because they're getting fucking. The Americans are getting fucking slaughtered. They want it to be over. They would have taken a surrender, but every time a Mexican National Guardsman tried to put up a white flag of surrender, one of the San Patricios would just come over and tear it down so that they could keep fighting.
Damn.
This happened 3 times. So eventually, oh, I forgot to mention the worst part.
What is the worst part?
Yeah. So when the Mexican troops started to run out of ammunition, the general in command like angrily shot off like a message to shot off a letter to back to Mexico City demanding more ammunition for his troops to keep on fighting. And they did send some ammunition. The problem was the ammunition.
They didn't send enough?
They did. It would have been enough if it weren't for the fact that it was all American ammunition. So it was the ammunition made for American guns, which they had captured in a previous engagement. And so all of the Mexican National Guardsmen couldn't use it. The only people who could use it were the San Patricios, which is why they kept fighting on for so long, or why they were able to fight on for so long.
Wow.
Yeah, and they probably could have kept it up for a while, but then one of their cannon shots shot off a spark, which then ignited all of that ammunition and blew it up in the convent.
Fuck.
Yeah, killing about a dozen San Patricios in the explosion. Yeah, it was not good. So then the Americans, the storm into the convent, fight the San Patricios in like a really nasty, brutal melee for a little while, but then finally the San Patricios surrender, and by the end of the battle, about 60% of the San Patricios are either killed, wounded, or captured, including John Riley, who has been captured.
That sounds like normal war. Would you count that as just something fucked up or just normal war?
No. What they're about to do is what's going to be the fucked up part.
Okay.
So the Americans, excuse me, the Americans take 72 of the San Patricios as POWs.
Gotcha.
Most of them are wounded in some way. Yeah. And all 72 of them are court-martialed for desertion. Despite the fact that not all of them were actually deserters from the U.S. Army.
Fuck off.
Yeah, a good chunk of them were just guys that were already living in Mexico at the time and had never actually, like, lived in the United States or been, like, part of the United States at all. And had just enlisted in the Mexican army when the war broke out.
That's some bullshit.
But they were tried as deserters as well. None of them had legal counsel. And the court-martial was more of a show trial because, of course, their fate was already predetermined. Because I can't emphasize enough, at this point, the San Patricios were the boogeymen of the U.S., like the U.S. Army in Mexico by this point. And the public back home in the U.S. They were like priority number one, not only because they'd killed so many American troops, but because the specter of like Irish Catholic desertions and betrayals of the U.S. Army was so terrifying because they were such a big part of the American forces that they wanted to make an example of the San Patricios.
Well, of course they did.
Yeah, basically tell all of the remaining Irish in the army, if you ever think about deserting, you're going to get the San Patricio treatment. 48, or I'm sorry, 50 of the 72 San Patricios were sentenced to death. 48 of them were sentenced to be executed by hanging, and then 2 of them were killed by firing squad. This is in violation of the U.S. Army legal code at the time, because the legal code clearly stipulates that a deserter in a time of war, should they be captured and sentenced to death at a court martial, has to be executed by firing squad, because it is faster and it is less painful than hanging. Hanging is specifically reserved for 2 types of people. They are reserved for spies. So if you're discovered spying for the enemy while you're an active member of the U.S. Army, then you are hanged. Or if you are discovered raping or murdering civilians and you are put on trial, or you are court-martialed and you are sentenced to death, then you are hanged. Deserters did not get hanging. Deserters got firing squad, and there were reasons for that, because desertion was considered a lesser crime with a whole bunch of mitigating circumstances than spying or like killing civilians, stuff like that.
But the U.S. was like, nah, fuck it.
Yeah, it's the decision to hang them was not based on legal code or doctrine. It was based on trying to send a message. The Irish soldiers, when they were executed, the commander who was overseeing the colonel who was overseeing their execution, they were executed at a place called San Andhill, and they were executed at a place called San Andhill. And San Andhill was just outside of Mexico City. This was during the push into Mexico City proper, and it was right outside a fortress on the edge of Mexico City called Chapultepec Castle. And the colonel who was overseeing the execution decided that to be theatrical, he would wait until the American forces lowered the Mexican flag from Chapultepec Castle and raised the American flag, just to kind of put a statement on the execution.
One last fuck you.
He was not counting on the stiffness of the Mexican defense at the castle, because he got all of the prisoners up at dawn, right around the same time that the fortress was being attacked, and expected the Mexican flag to be down within 20, 30 minutes. Shouldn't take too long. Took them 5 hours.
Fuck yeah.
Because the Mexican defense of the fortress was so stiff. And so it took 5 hours for the American troops at Chapultepec Castle to finally raise the American flag. And so all of the Irish San Patricios were waiting with nooses around their necks, just watching for this flag to finally be risen so that they could be put out of their fucking misery, so they didn't have to stand in the hot fucking July sun any longer. In the middle of Mexico in the summer. It was miserable for them. While they were waiting, one of the San Patricios, this is so fucking funny. I thought when I was listening to the audiobook and I got to this part, I physically laughed when they told this story. When the narrator told this story. So there was one San Patricio. He was waiting at the stock with the noose around his neck, and he calls out to the colonel, "Hey, Colonel, can I have a smoke before I die?" And the colonel's like, "Yeah, I guess so." And so he walks up to this Irish guy, and something else to mention, just to kind of put a big fuck you on this whole execution. The colonel that they got to oversee these executions was Irish.
Ah, fuck off. That's sick.
Yeah, he was a first generation Irish American who had converted from his Catholic upbringing to Protestantism in order to advance in the U.S. Army ranks, and he had bright red hair, like Irish red hair, and so this the San Patricio asked the colonel, "Hey, can you give me a smoke?" And the colonel's like, "Yeah, okay." And so he walks up, he pulls out his pipe, and he puts some tobacco in it, and then the San Patricio says, "Yeah, just put it in my mouth. You can light it with your hair." And this pisses the colonel off so badly that he pulls out his saber and bashes the San Patricio in the mouth with the hilt of his saber.
Damn.
And this he hits him so hard that it destroys the guy's jaw. He loses like a bunch of teeth. He just starts spitting out like several teeth. And then he looks up with blood like streaming out of his mouth. And he looks up at the colonel with a smile and he says, "Oh, that's a shame. I'm not going to be able to hold a pipe in my mouth again for the rest of my life."
Fuck. The balls on that man.
The balls on this guy. So they wait. So these guys are forced to wait 48. Like, well, I think this was like 35 guys. I think some of the other San Patricios. This was 30 guys. Some of the other San Patricios get executed later, but these 30 guys, they are forced to wait out here with nooses around their necks for about 5 hours until the U.S. flag finally flies over the castle. When the flag finally rises over the castle, all of the San Patricios who are there start cheering and whooping and celebrating because they're finally, like, the wait is finally over and they can finally die and get it over with. And this pissed off a lot of the American observers very badly because they thought the Irishmen weren't taking this too seriously. Gee, why wouldn't an Irishman take something seriously? It's so out of character for them.
I don't think most Irishmen take anything seriously.
Yeah, absolutely not. So 48 San Patricios were killed by hanging. 2 of them were killed by firing squad. The rest, including John Riley, were sentenced to like a lighter deserter's punishment. Their punishment was to receive 50 lashes on their bare back and a branding with the letter D on their body. D for deserter. Now, I have to explain something real quick.
Fuck.
First of all, within the American legal code, the American military legal code at the time, the official punishment, if you were to lash somebody who is deserted, the official punishment for lashing is to not exceed 30. The limit is 30 lashes. They were sentenced.
So they broke their own rules.
They broke their own rules. And then they broke their own rules further because as John Riley was being lashed, in the middle of the lashes, the colonel who was overseeing said, "Oh, wait, hold on, I lost count." And so John Riley ended up receiving 58 lashes when he was sentenced to 50. By eyewitnesses say that by the end of his punishment, his back looked like a clump of raw steak.
Yeah, that sounds like it's both something fucked up the U.S. did, but also John getting fucked over, so that's forceps.
Yeah, sure. Works for me.
Well, I mean, the hangings were something fucked up as too, so I was just calling all our sips, you know?
Yeah, that is your purview. So another thing that they did was that according to the law code for court-martials, the punishment for a deserter, should he be sentenced to be branded with the letter D, is that the brand should be administered on the left hip for a first offender. So if it's your first time deserting and you're captured and you're sentenced to be branded, you are branded with the letter D on your left hip, just once. If you desert a second time, then you're branded a second time, just once, on your right hip.
So they just kept breaking the rules left and right.
Yeah, the way that they break the rules for this one is so incredibly fucked up. Um, hold on, hold on, hold the fuck on. So what they do instead is that the colonel orders that John Riley be branded on his left cheek, on his face.
Fuck.
And the soldier who is, yes, the soldier who is being ordered to do so argues with the colonel and saying, "No, I am not going to brand a man on the face. That is heinous and horrific and evil. I refuse to do it." And then the colonel threatened him with a court martial as well for insubordination. And so the soldier picks up the brand and with trembling hands presses the brand onto John Riley's left cheek. And then when he pulls it away, he discovers to his horror that he has branded the D backwards. And so the colonel, upon seeing that the D has been branded backwards, says, "You messed it up. Turn over to his other cheek and do it again correctly this time."
Oh. This man does not have a pit of hell deep enough.
Yeah, this is insane. This is incredible how heinous this and explicit this is. And so, yes, John Riley comes out of this with a D for deserter branded on each cheek. And then after these punishments, he and the other surviving San Patricios are put into prison for the duration of the war, which is only another couple months. So, Mexico City ultimately fell, and Mexico ended up losing the war. They capitulated and surrendered in late 1846. Upon the signing of the treaty, the remaining San Patricios were released and returned back to the Mexican army. After the war, many of the San Patricios returned to Europe. Some of them, like Riley, even after all of this, after these brands, he still stayed in the Mexican army and made a career out of it. And a lot of the San Patricios did. They stayed in the Mexican army. They fought in like future wars that Mexico had. And Riley himself would eventually retire from the Mexican army with full honors, with the rank of, the official name of the rank in English, it's called a permanent colonel, which doesn't exist in the U.S. Army. It's usually like shorthanded or nicknamed to the rank commandante. But he's medically retired in 1850 because he catches yellow fever. So many of the San Patricios, they stay in the army. Some of them settle in Mexico, and they become citizens. A lot of them become like very prominent businessmen. Some of them just like regular farmers, stuff like that. And to this day, there are a lot of families scattered throughout Mexico that still have Irish last names. There is a
With how much they fought for Mexico in the Mexican-American War, I can't blame them.
yeah, there's a pretty large Mexican family in northern Mexico today whose last name is Donovan. So John Riley, after he retired from the Mexican army, he basically just falls off the face of the earth. We have no idea what happened to him. We don't know how long he lived after he left the army. We don't know where he died. We don't know what he was doing when he died. We don't know if he had a family. We know absolutely nothing about him after he's discharged from the army. He just disappeared. There's just nothing. His essentially all we know about the man is his life in the Mexican army, and that's it. This in American scholarship, the San Patricios have for a long time been regarded as deserters and traitors, and that's the way that they've been discussed, if they've been discussed at all, in American academia and American history. This has especially been pushed by Irish Americans, strangely enough, because Irish Americans, in their effort to try to integrate into white American society. Part of this history of Irish deserting from the U.S. Army and fighting against the Americans, they wanted to kind of portray them as sort of like I mentioned before, kind of as mercenaries and drunkards and traitors and scoundrels and people with no honor and no loyalty, that kind of thing. Um, so when the San Patricios were discussed in America, that's how they were discussed. More often than not, they just weren't. They were forgotten. They were forgotten alongside the Mexican American War. Nobody ever talks about them because nobody ever talks about the Mexican American War, because looking back on it and thinking about it makes the United States look really, really bad in hindsight.
Because they did some heinous shit.
Yeah, yeah, they did some fucking heinous shit. In Mexico, however, the San Patricios are remembered with great affection. They are remembered as heroes and martyrs for the Mexican cause. They are revered in, like, there are places named after the San Patricios all over the country, especially in Mexico City and in northern Mexico. The church, the Catholic church that they were executed in front of, is still has a memorial to them. The city, the Mexico City, the government of Mexico City, still holds like memorial celebrations for the San Patricios every year on St. Patrick's Day, and it's a sort of like a point of friendship and solidarity between Mexico and Ireland. Whenever there are official, like, diplomatic delegations or like public presentations about between Ireland and Mexico, the San Patricios are always brought up as like a point of friendship in the connected history between Ireland and Mexico, as two Catholic peoples who threw off the bonds of foreign oppression and survived to preserve their own unique culture and their own faith in the face of aggression and imperialism. It's a very strong point of friendship between the two nations. Overall, though, in both countries, Mexico and the United States, and I guess Ireland as well, they just really weren't that well studied. They weren't that well understood. They weren't that well recognized as part of the history of the Mexican American War. And that was until a man named an author named Michael Hogan released a book called The Irish Soldiers of Mexico in 1997, which was the main book that I used as a source for this episode. That book basically compiled all of the existing scholarship of the San Patricios and correlated or refuted all of the existing viewpoints and conceptions about them with documentation and records from both from the United States and from the Mexican government, and put it all together and formed like the most clear and comprehensive picture we have of the San Patricios in the context of their time. It is a fucking brilliant book. It is an incredible work of scholarship. And not only is it a great work of academic scholarship, it is one of the most endearing and fun reads that I have ever had from a history book. It's such a good, well put together book that's entertaining while still being like very scholarly and appreciative of the topic and of the setting of the times.
It really feels like it's combining like praise, but also in a
Feels like what?
manner that's telling. It's praising them in a manner that really is like not.
Ah, man, none of this is coming through, man. I'm sorry.
Ignore me. I don't even know how I'm going to put it.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I didn't get a full. Okay. Um, So, The Irish Soldiers of Mexico was actually adapted into a movie in 1999 called One Man's Hero. One Man's Hero was ultimately the initial release of the movie in the United States was actually delayed because they were afraid that there would be like a public backlash against a movie that portrayed the U.S. military as the unadulterated bad guys,
Which they 100% were.
which they fucking were, absolutely, without question. There was, yeah, it's just,
It's like that one meme, are we the bad guys?
yeah. So, thanks to this book and to a lot of like a lot of like more recent like consideration on them from like popular media and like music and like smaller stuff like YouTube videos and stuff like that. The San Patricios have started to be kind of rediscovered as part of the United States the darker side of the United States history, which is starting to come more into the light in recent years. And it's starting to become like a more popular part of people's understanding of American history. And the San Patricios have been part of that as like a form of an example of defiance against that dark history, a piece of hope to latch on to that these evil, objectively evil, horrific, morally reprehensible parts of American history. There were people that didn't just stand by and watch it happen. They risked life and limb and did what was right to stand up against it when they saw that it was happening. And that to me that provides a bit of hope to myself as well. Like we live in a very broken, distorted culture, and we need hope that there's the ability to stand up to it, even if we lose. Like it's still worth it, and I think that's what I take from the San Patricios, and it's is from what I've seen, I can tell it's a very great honor to have as part of the legacy to both the Irish and the Mexican people, and they very much appreciate that it is a part of their history, and I think it's something that everybody, that all of us can really genuinely learn from and revere.
Oh, definitely. Like this is, I wish we had learned about them.
And I think that's it. That's all I've got.
All right, where can they find you?
They can find me on Twitter at Visigoth. The first I is a 1, the O is a 0. On Blue Sky at Visigoth. The I is just a regular I, the O is a 0. Tim, plug all the good stuff.
So they can find me on both Blue Sky and Twitter at Tim, aka Otis. And then they can find the podcast on Facebook and Instagram at The Alexander Society Pod. And then they can find us on Twitter and Blue Sky at Alex Society Pod. And then they can find us on TikTok at Alexander Society, where we're hoping to get bear reviews. I should at least be posting mine. And you'll get some outtakes and episode announcements when we have them out. If you have liked what you've listened to, please give us a rate and review on your streaming platform of choice. We thank you, and we will see you next time.
Bye.